This is usually how a new Iranian wave film begins. Long takes in rural areas with minimal characters. But before discussing the ascetical traits of Iranian films, we should know the circumstances that led to that new wave being born. Up until the late 1950s and early 1960s, Iranian cinema consisted of formulaic melodramas and musicals. Films making social critiques were heavily censored or banned altogether. The first new wave, which occurred in the 1960s with films such as The Cow and The House is Black, brought a kind of realism to Iranian cinema which had been missing. The 1979 uprising aimed at getting rid of the Pahlavi dynasty after World War I. European rivalries heated up because of the discovery of oil in the Middle East, so they helped engineer a change in dynasty by supporting military commander Reza Khan in his coup in February 1921. Reza Khan became Reza Shah, and then he attempted to turn Persia, which he renamed Iran in 1935, into a modern secular Western-style state. But Reza Shah is best remembered for his dictatorial repression, which turned the clergy against him, so he abdicated, and his young son Mohammad Reza Shah became the leader of Iran and remained so until 1979. Although the Shah was an autocrat who imposed censorship and arrested politicians, Iran saw huge improvements. In 1963, the Shah had tried to institute what he called a White Revolution, which led to modernization, and in many ways he was successful, especially in improving industry and education. But the White Revolution was opposed by the Shia clerk, the Ayatollah Khomeini. One of his main complaints was that the reform would grant rights to women, including the right to vote. But this was not the only reason that started the 1979 revolution, as it did not start out to create an Islamic state. At first, it was a pretty typical uprising by dissatisfied Iranians to overthrow a government that they perceived as corrupt and unresponsive to their needs due to economic inequality and political repression. The reason that Iranian revolution is always perceived as Islamic revolution is that the initial demonstrations did begin after an Iranian newspaper on January 7th, 1978 published an article that was critical of Khomeini while he was in Paris. These initial demonstrations were pretty small, but when the government police and armed forces started firing on the demonstrators and killing some of them, the protests grew.
We try to change dictator. We have another dictator, but in religious style.
Another reason for the revolution was tied to criticism of the West. According to a woman who participated, American lifestyle had come to be imposed as an ideal. The ultimate goal, Americanism, was the model. American popular culture, books, magazines, films, had swept over our country like a flood. We found ourselves wondering, is there any room for our own culture? The Islamic Revolution created the opportunity for religious committees, such as the Ministry for the Prevention of Sins, to take complete control of censorship. Religious codes informed strict ascetic modesty laws, dictating what was or was not morally acceptable for viewing, even having to approve screenplays at the pre-production stage.
اینکه سانسور فیلم در ایران چه ویژگی‌هایی داره، مهمترین ویژگیش اینه که بدون ویژگیه. قابل پیش بینی نیست، قابل شناسایی نیست، مدون نیست.
Self-censorship is predominant because there are certain taboos in our culture.
Thus, The question often asked is whether the new Iranian cinema emerged in spite of this restriction on freedom of expression, or in some ways because of it. Restrictive circumstances can have the ironic side effect of motivating artists to invent indirect means of expressing their ideas. The specific limitations on intimate subject matter can be deemed largely responsible for the preponderance of mid to long shots, the general absence of shot-reverse shot editing patterns, the difficulty of filming in interiors, specifically to mystic spaces, the impossibility of showing actual physical contact between characters, or characters gazing into or close to the camera. Censorship rules also can account for the choice of rural settings and use of child protagonists, both providing greater freedom. Rural women can be realistically imagined outdoors in traditional garments, unlike urban women. The modesty laws are also far looser towards children, who moreover can be used to get subtle, veiled allergies past censors, who are less suspicious of what appears to be an innocent child's tale. The allegorical tendency available to all art becomes exaggerated in the case of repressive regimes. An example of this is Tall Shadows of the Wind by Bahman Farmanura. The film follows the unexpected consequences that arise when Abdullah, a bus driver for a small village, decides to draw a face in his own likeness on a scarecrow in one of the village's fields. While other villagers describe this as a childish act and suggest that Abdullah needs to get married so that he will mature, the scarecrow nonetheless begins to take on increasing significance for the village. At times, the film assumes the generic conventions of a horror film with a suspenseful and discordant score accompanied by sound effects that suggest something stalking the night, and lighting that shrouds the film in darkness or lets shadows play across the screen. These formal features justify several narrative points, where characters become terrified of the scarecrow. At other times, the film moves away from the horror genre and focuses on the strange, almost reverential relationship that has developed between the scarecrow and various villages. Later in the film, a woman from the village causes concern when she pours water over the head of the scarecrow, and then her own, suggesting she is including the scarecrow in the preparation for prayer. The film ends with the burning of the scarecrow and Abdullah's contraction of gangrene, an ailment that requires him to cut off one of his legs. Faced with proposition of resembling the scarecrow, the villagers' response to the scarecrow, whether one of fear or reverence, might be construed as a metaphor for the Iranian people's reaction to the regime of the Shah or the religion of the revolutionary regime. Despite this potential for social critique, the actual reason given by the Committee for the Prevention of Sin after the revolution for the film censorship was the inaccurately estimated number of scarecrows burnt in the film. The censors claimed that the 13 scarecrows were burnt, suggesting a correlation with the burning of 14 saints, or the 14 infallibles of Shia Islam. But luckily, Ayatollah Khomeini admired some films like The Cow, and thought that cinema could have potential positive effects on society, The first few years after the revolution were therefore a very uncertain time for Iranian cinema. And following the enormous and rapid social upheaval brought by the devastating Iran-Iraq War, the conservative religious regime needed the filmmakers to document current events. Later, the need to entertain a public hungry for cinema forced the only state production and distribution foundation, Farabi, to let go of its monopoly and to encourage directors to raise their own funds. Although Iranian films' stylistic range is wide, films are often made with non-professional actors, filmed on location rather than in studios, use direct sound, contain a number of long takes, and tend to have simple narratives, commonly open-ended, with seemingly little dramatization or sensationalization, often set in rural areas of Iran and focusing on lower-class characters. This approach has drawn many comparisons between the new Iranian cinema and the Italian neorealist films, such as The Bicycle Thieves for De Sica. The use of child protagonists also resonates on a national scale. There are often allegorical stand-ins for something wider, like Samira Makalbaf's debut film The Apple provides such an example. The pseudo-documentary narrative is based on a real-life event concerning two 11-year-old twins who were locked up inside their home by an overprotective father. This attracted Samira's interests, as for her it was the story of our nation. Samira, however, refuses to judge or condemn in the film, instead casting an anthropological eye on the girls slowly making their first steps towards the outside world, an optimistic metaphor for Iran's slow course towards a more open society. Other similarities with the Italian neorealism is the class consciousness which reflects an enduring thematic concern of the new Iranian cinema, which has seldom focused on the affluent middle classes of large cities like Tehran, either in setting or in character, except to present a contrast of social milieus such as The Traveller for Abbas Kiarostami.
چرا نخوردی؟ خود زودتر میخوردی نهار تو. چند ساعت داریم مسابقه؟ مسابقه 3 ساعت داریم حالا. 3 ساعت داریم.
اون قیه استخ چقدر؟ اون قش
Iranian New Wave had been influenced by the French New Wave and other modernist currents of 1960s cinema. for the way it self-consciously interrogates the effects of the medium on the construction of everyday reality. But also more specifically, for the recurring use of final freeze frames, a motif made famous by Truffaut's The 400 Blows. The French New Wave adapted much of the image repertoire created by neorealism, but gave the images a reflexive spin, an effect that can also be seen in New Iranian Cinema. A pure optical and sound situation, instead of extending into movement, enters into relationship with a virtual image like a thought, dream, memory, or déjà vu. The zigzag path on the hill between villages in Where Is My Friend's House is an exemplary open image. We see Ahmed's tiny figure running up and down across the hillside 3 times in the film, mostly in a static framing and in long shot. The distant view and length of the take, in the absence of any conventional action, force us to concentrate on the image and absorb the abstraction imposed on the environment. Kiarostami had the path specially built for the film and planted a tree on the top of the hill, which reflects his concern for not just recording reality, but making it carry certain poetic resonances. Some of these are symbolic. The tree on the top stands for friendship, while Ahmed's zigzagging symbolizes the hurrying around in modern life. Kiarostami, speaking about close-up, claimed that even I, the filmmaker, gets confused as to which parts were fiction and which documentary. This could be applied to many New Iranian Cinema films generally, since blurring the lines between documentary and fiction, life and art, reality and film, is at the heart of much Iranian cinema. This fragmentation also rose up by the influence of poetry and folk tales like the Arabian Nights, which framed by the story within the story of Prince Shahrazad. One knows one is watching a fiction, Kiarostami's close-up, that is based on fact, Zabzian's real story. That is based on fiction, Zabzian pretending to be Makhmalbaf. That is based on fact, Makhmalbaf as a leading Iranian filmmaker. That is based on fiction, Makhmalbaf making fictional stories in film. That is based on fact, the reality Makhmalbaf transforms into fiction. Kiarostami manipulates his material with skill, playing with the audience's expectations of documentary realism. For example, in the scene where Zabzian finally meets the real Makhmalbaf, the film crew is heard off screen, and the sound is cut under the false pretense of equipment failure. In fact, this was a deliberate ploy to intensify the emotional power of the scene.
یعنی چه رد شد؟
یا از فیشه یا از میکروفون گردنی آقای مخملباف. وسایل مستعمل دیگه. سیمش از داخل قطع بس میکنه. سال 52 داره کار میکنه دیگه. 3 دومه. درست.
همینجوری بخواد قطع وصل بشی؟
الان اینطوریه دیگه.
آقای سبزیان هستی؟
A constant tension between what is or isn't staged persists and forces us to question the veracity of realism and of film itself as a medium. In Panahi's The Mirror, a young girl trying to get home unexpectedly breaks the cinematic illusion midway through the film by stating that she no longer wants to act. And action cuts to Panahi and his crew debating what to do next. This recurring motif of self-referentially making films about filmmaking process itself also appears in much of the work of Kiarostami and Mohsen Makhmalbaf. Although Iranian New Wave has many common attributes to the Italian Neorealism and the French New Wave, as many Iranian filmmakers had been influenced by European cinema at that time, but also Iranian films have their unique aspects that mainly rose up due to domestic affairs that resulted in peculiar films in form and content.